I'm currently holding 7 extremely weak CPUs, and I mean weak. We're talking everything from old Core 2 Duo chips released 16 years ago, all the way up to the strongest one in the lineup, which still only has 2 cores. In today's video, I'm throwing every single one of them into Minecraft, cranking the settings all the way to max, and seeing whether they can even run the game. And if they can, just how painful the experience will be. Honestly, I'm not even sure all of them will survive this test. Alright, and here we have our very first victim of the day. The Intel Core 2 Duo E5700, a prehistoric relic from, well, a very, very long time ago. 2 cores, ancient architecture, and pretty much forgotten by the entire world in 2025. But today, I'm dragging it into Minecraft, cranking everything to max settings and even forcing it to run shaders like it's some kind of modern gaming CPU. If the game completely tanks in FPS or starts lagging like a PowerPoint presentation, honestly, that's expected. This poor chip was never built for this kind of torture. But hey, let's give it a chance. Maybe, just maybe, this old grandpa still has a little life left in him. Oh my god, this thing is lagging like crazy. You can literally count every single frame. The FPS is basically running in binary. It's either 0 or 1, and on a good day, it might touch 2 FPS. It feels like the CPU is screaming at me to turn the chunks down. Alright, so after dropping the render distance to 8 chunks, the CPU finally started to breathe a little, but the game was still pretty much unplayable. Only when I lowered it all the way to the minimum did the FPS climb up a bit, barely over 20 FPS. Better, but still not smooth. It wasn't until I dropped the resolution down to plain HD that the game finally started to feel playable. Our second contestant stepping up to the torture chamber is the Intel Pentium G3250. This little guy came out in 2014, about a year after the 1150 socket launched. Sounds a lot newer than the ancient E5700, right? Well, kind of. In reality, it's only about 1.7 times faster, and yup, still just 2 cores. Still not exactly impressive in today's gaming world. Oh man. The moment I launched the game, the FPS was tragic. It looked more like a slideshow than Minecraft, barely hitting double digits, and even simple movement felt painfully slow. Sometimes it spiked to around 17 FPS, but only for a second before dropping straight back to 0. Lowering the chunk distance helped a bit, giving me around 30 FPS in the forest, and dropping to the lowest chunk setting pushed it to 40 to 50 FPS. Switching to 720p boosted FPS by another 10 to 15 frames, but the average still hovered around 35, proving it's nowhere near stable, even at the lowest settings. Next up is the Intel Core i3-2120, a CPU that was actually pretty reliable back in its day. If you bought a budget PC years ago and still wanted to watch movies, open a dozen browser tabs, do homework, and play a few light games, chances are you've at least heard of this chip. Let's see if there's still a spark of its youth left, or if it's finally time for retirement. Oh my god. This is actually not bad at all. FPS is sitting around 70, totally playable, and more importantly, no crazy drops like the previous CPU. Of course, this is at the lowest chunk setting and 720p, so let's push it a bit. At 1080p, the FPS instantly drops by half, holding around 40 FPS while I'm chopping trees. Still playable, but keep in mind this is with the lowest chunk distance. Once I bumped it to 8 chunks, the FPS cut in half again. Not terrible, but definitely starting to struggle. Then I decided to torture it with 32 chunks, and yeah, FPS tanked to about 10 to 15. Super laggy and barely playable. So realistically, this CPU is only comfortable around 8 chunks if you want a smooth experience. Alright, let's step away from Team Intel for a moment and move over to their longtime rival, AMD. In today's lineup, we've got the A8 5600K. A chip I actually tested in a previous video, so I won't go into its whole backstory again. All you really need to know is that this thing used to be the definition of budget all-rounder, and surprised a lot of people back in the day. So instead of talking it up, let's just drop it straight into Minecraft at max settings and see if it can still prove itself. At 1080p with the lowest chunk settings, the FPS sits around 50, which is surprisingly stable and perfectly playable. It's not a massive leap compared to the previous CPU, but the average FPS is nearly double, and the overall smoothness is noticeably better. Of course, this is the easy mode that almost any CPU can handle, so let's crank things up a bit. At 8 chunks, the FPS doesn't drop too drastically, still holding around 30 to 35 FPS. The iGPU, though, is working overtime at 100% load, so if you're running an APU using dual-channel RAM is a must for better performance. Now for the real challenge, 32 chunks. And yeah, the FPS crashes to around 10 to 15, turning the game into visual torture. Definitely not a playable setting for this poor CPU. And speaking of comebacks, here comes the Intel i3 4130, the younger sibling of the 2120, but noticeably stronger. It showed up right when PC games started getting a bit more demanding, so it didn't choke the moment you pressed play like the older chips sometimes did. It's basically the smaller brother who actually hits the gym. So yeah, facing Minecraft on max settings this time, the i3 4130 walks in, looking much more confident. At the start, the results were rough. The game was extremely laggy, and when I flew up into the sky and looked down at all the loaded chunks, the FPS tanked to around 3 to 5 FPS. Basically a slideshow. But after the world finished loading, things became a bit more manageable at around 15 FPS, which honestly feels very similar to the A85-600K experience. Dropping to 8 chunks helped a lot. The CPU finally caught a break and the game held around 30 to 40 FPS. Lowering the chunks to the minimum pushed it slightly higher, hitting close to 50 FPS, though it still couldn't break past that 60 FPS mark. Switching down to 720p, however, changed everything. FPS shot up to a stable 90 FPS and occasionally even crossed the 100 FPS mark. Much smoother overall. And finally, saying goodbye to socket 1150, we're stepping up one digit to socket 1151. Representing this lineup today is the legendary, or maybe not so legendary, Pentium G 4400. Most people know this CPU as the budget, low-power option, the kind of chip that's perfectly happy just booting up and opening Chrome. I've almost never heard anyone brag about its gaming performance. And honestly, when you look at the specs, you kind of understand why. 2 cores, 2 threads, and a locked 3.3 GHz clock. That's it. Nothing fancy, nothing spicy, but just because it's humble doesn't mean I'm going to go easy on it. No, we're pushing this thing straight into the fire. Let's see what happens next. At 1080p with the lowest chunk settings, this CPU honestly gave me 2 completely different emotions, with disappointment being the stronger one. Sure, the FPS can spike up to around 70 FPS, which sounds great on paper, but the moment I swing the camera quickly or run into anything even slightly complex, it drops like crazy. And as we all know, a high FPS number means nothing if the experience isn't stable. Bumping it up to 8 chunks made things even worse. The FPS jumped all over the place, totally inconsistent, and at some moments it even performed worse than an i3-2120. At this point, I can confidently say this is the worst performer in today's entire lineup. It wasn't until I lowered the resolution down to 720p that things finally became somewhat playable again. And the final victim on our list is the Intel Core i3 7100. This thing was basically known as one of Intel's biggest missteps. A 7th gen chip that somehow performed worse than some 4th gen i3s. On paper it sounds okay. 2 cores, 4 threads. But when it launched, most people just sighed in disappointment. And before the i3.7000 even had a chance to prove itself, Intel dropped the 8th gen lineup, which was way stronger for almost the same price. After that, the 7100 was pretty much ignored altogether. So today, throwing it into Minecraft on max settings is kind of like giving it a shot at redemption. A chance to see if it can win back even a tiny bit of respect. And this is exactly why people call this CPU weak. At 32 chunks, it performs no better than a G3250. The poor 2-core, 4-thread chip is getting absolutely crushed. Dropping to 8 chunks gets me around 60 FPS, and going to minimum settings pushes it past 100, but it's never stable. Even at 720p, the CPU bottleneck is obvious. A 1300 TNT blast tanked the FPS, but it recovered quickly. Thanks so much for sticking around and watching my video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe to the channel. Alright, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.